Welcome, everyone. It is so refreshing and so amazing to see everyone joining in. Welcome once more. My name is Madrasa-Midrasha. I am the director of the Madrasa-Midrasha program here at the GTU and the assistant professor of Islamic studies. And it is my pleasure to welcome you and introduce this event today as part of our generous grant from the Walter and Elise Haas Fund. We are able to bring this program, which is going to celebrate some of the emerging scholarship that our senior faculty are curating here at the GTU. And what a lovely way to celebrate the 60th year of the GTU, and of course the 15th year anniversary for the Center for Islamic Studies. We have two of our bright emerging scholars here today, Leah Macinskas-Le and May Kosba, great achievers who are blessed with great mentors. And it is my pleasure to invite Professor Dina Aronoff, who is the director of the Center for Jewish Studies and a senior lecturer of Jewish Studies here at the GTU, and Dr. Munir Jiwa, who is the director of the Center for Islamic Studies and an anthropologist in Islamic Studies. And I am going to hand this event over to Dina and Munir to moderate and to invite our brilliant speakers for today. And as always, Matt has been here, our tech angel, who is going to make sure that this program runs smoothly. A quick housekeeping reminder that we're aiming for this program to end by 1 p.m. today. So we're aiming for this to be a lunchtime program, 1 p.m. And we'll have short presentations and a quick Q&A after that. So please feel free to add your questions into the chat and we will pick them up as we go along. Without further ado, please welcome Dina Aronoff.
Thank you so much, Majabin. It's been such a delight to work with you, Majabin, our director of the Madrasa-Midrasha program. You bring so much vision and so much commitment to campus life and to our scholarship and our community engagement. We feel very lucky that you're here, and thank you for the invitation to be a part of this plenary today. I'm so excited to hear from our graduate students. That's what this hour is about. There's much I could say about the Center for Jewish Studies. Many of you have been a part of our coursework and our programming. What I would just share with you is I invite you to mark your calendars for December 1st, a lunchtime event on the future of Jewish theology, hosted by CJS faculty Sam Shonkoff, with some amazing current thinkers in the world of Jewish thought, Mara Benjamin, Joy Layden, and Ariel Mays. So please mark your calendars for that. I'm going to transition right to an introduction to Leah Macinskas-Le, graduate student here at the GTU. Leah has a BA in Classics and Critical Theory from McGill University, as well as a Master of Divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary, followed by a Master of Arts in Ancient Judaism from the Jewish Theological Seminary of America in New York. Her studies at the Jewish Theological Seminary, for which she was the recipient of the B.E. Cohen Merit Scholarship, culminated in an MA thesis titled The Sociological Implication of Halachic Debates in the Second Temple Period, Qumran, the New Testament, and the Mishnah. As you could see, Leah lives in the literatures of the ancient and late ancient world, Greek, Hebrew, Rabbinic, Christian, and lives in the intersections of those worlds and those literatures. Leah is extending her research in her PhD work at the GTU, for which she was awarded the prestigious Presidential Scholarship. Most specifically, her doctoral research focuses upon the socio-rhetorical function of Torah observance, halachic debates, that is, debates about Jewish practice, in the Gospel of Matthew and the Dead Sea Scrolls, especially the Damascus document and 4Q MMT, the halachic letter. There's a lot of specialized knowledge in a lot of those titles. Leah, I hope that in your presentation, you can really reach out to the full audience here. Tell us about your work, where it's at. We're really eager to hear from you. And remember, to the listeners, if questions come to your mind, you're welcome to type them into the chat, and I'll be curating the Q&A at the very end of both presentations this afternoon. After Leah, Munir will greet us and introduce May. We'll hear from May and then open it up for discussion. So without further ado, Leah, please.
Thank you so much, Dina, Majabeen, Matt, and Munir and May and everyone else who's joined. Yes, so there is unfortunately a lot of specialized information there. So I've got a little script here that I'm going to read. This is the research for my PhD dissertation, and I'm going to try to explicate and summarize that as I go along. And please excuse my cat; he's asleep in the background and may decide to wake up and walk around. Starting. In his book, Qumran and Jerusalem, Lawrence Schiffman says, he says, for ancient Jews, indeed for Jews throughout the ages until the rise of modernity, the life of Torah in its various interpretations was the dominant form of law and religious expression. Torah is the Hebrew word for the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis through Deuteronomy. And it means, in Hebrew, it means instruction. In Greek, it's usually translated as nomos by ancient Jews into law, the word law. But it's more than that. It is a promise between God and the people that he's chosen, the people of Israel, that they're going to do certain things, and in turn, God will do things in return and preserve the people. Schiffman's comment is both accurate and a vast overstatement. One only has to look, for example, at the massive production of poetry and the interest in mystic Kabbalah in the Middle Ages to see that there has been a great deal more to Jewish religious expression than just interpreting Torah. At the same time, Torah holds an outsized role in the self-definition of the Jewish people. 2,000 years ago, Josephus could write that all the world recognized that Jews agreed on the fact that there was one God, one temple, and one Torah. Josephus, of course, is being as polemical as Schiffman, but the fact remains that he chose Torah as one of the defining characteristics of Jewishness. Josephus and Schiffman are also correct in that the interpretation of Torah has been a key activity in Jewish history. Dwarfing every other collection of texts, even the Bible, the texts created by this activity, starting with the foundational texts of the Mishnah and the Babylonian Talmud, the other great texts from antiquity is the Tosefta and the Jerusalem Talmud, through the medieval Shulchan Aruch, and into responses still published today by rabbinic authorities. However, all of these texts post-date the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple in the Jewish revolt of 66 to 70 CE. It may not be surprising to find this kind of activity focused on interpreting sacred texts and codifying daily praxis after the central temple was destroyed. But here again, Josephus provides an interesting historical testimony. In his narrative of the Jewish war, he describes 3 main Jewish hierasis, or schools or divisions, that he cannot hide from his non-Jewish Roman audience. Many of the things that divided them had to do with their interpretation of Torah. This minor historical fact was exploded in the middle of the 20th century with the discovery of some scrolls in caves north of the Dead Sea. Here were found huge quantities of texts which reshaped the picture of Jewish life, practice, and belief before the revolt against Rome and before the classical rabbis of antiquity, including texts which seem to match the description of one of the practices of one of the Jewish groups that Josephus names, the Essenes. This shows that the questions of interpreting Torah was not solely a response from the rabbis to the loss of the central Jerusalem temple, but had something of a forerunner in the prior centuries. In 1994, a further text, which is known as either 4QMMT or the Halachic Letter, was published. It was so named because they seemed to approach interpreting Torah the same way rabbis did, an activity known as halakha. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls also affected the study of the New Testament, as here were contemporaneous texts describing the same Jerusalem society that the Gospels do, and that Paul claims to have lived within. The historical resistance of Christianity, and especially Protestant Christianity, to anything resembling law in the teachings of Jesus, Paul, and other New Testament authors is slowly crumbling. My own research is focused on the rhetoric contained within these texts and teachings. I argue the fact that we now have multiple records of these debates, arguments, and even accusations can lead us to the conclusion that Torah interpretation, what came to be known as halakha under the rabbis, was in fact a live issue and a social phenomenon a century before the rabbis would create their massive works. Josephus is witness to the fact that there were various groups who functioned in Jewish society in Palestine under the Roman Empire, and these groups disagreed on, among other things, how to interpret Torah. Furthermore, as witnessed by the New Testament and many of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the rhetoric in these disagreements could get very sharp and vicious. Unfortunately, without context, this rhetoric within the New Testament has a sad history of spawning more violence against Jews, especially as the Christian church grew in social and political power in the Western Roman Empire. I argue that these halakhic debates in the sectarian context of the Second Temple period, that is the period from, it starts in about 587 BCE and goes up to 70 CE. I concentrate in starting around 250. These debates were not solely about practical aspects of observing the laconic Torah, but performing in-group, out-group sociological functions. And therefore, the sharpness of this rhetoric in the Gospel of Matthew against the Pharisees, among others, is neither anti-Jewish nor anti-Torah, anti-law, but instead reminding and encouraging his audience in the competitive post-70 environment that Jesus was to be their authority for interpreting Torah and not the Pharisees. That the Dead Sea Scrolls also contain sharp rhetoric against their perceived opponents provides greater context for this. The group which created and preserved these texts called themselves the Yachad, or the community, and apparently removed themselves to the desert north of the Dead Sea in a location known as Qumran. One of the texts which seems to have described this group's conception of this event is a text known as Qumran, or the Halachic Letter. The abbreviated title comes from a Hebrew text, a Hebrew phrase in the last third of the text, Miktat Ma'aseh HaTorah, or these few things or possibly regulations regarding Torah. I take this to be an ancient sense of humor because the long middle section is significantly more than a few things. It contains many rulings on how to keep the commands of the Torah, especially in regards to the purity of the temple and its precincts. The last third is where the English name comes from. It appears to be a letter sent by the group at Qumran to someone in authority over the temple in Jerusalem. The letter urges the recipient to abide by these few things in order to avoid the prophetic curses laid out in Deuteronomy, which threaten the loss of the land and the city of Jerusalem. Qumran particularly witnesses the sectarian nature of the halakha in this period. They use a lot of we-you rhetoric, particularly at the end of the text, which outgroups the addressee of the letter, but allows that they may become part of this group if they adopt the practices detailed in the earlier section. This kind of in-group, out-group rhetoric can also be observed in other texts from Qumran, particularly the first few columns of the document known as the Damascus document. The opening lines of the Damascus document is addressed to all who know righteousness and understand the Ma'aseh El. A common English translation of this is the actions of God. But it is intriguing if we might import the translation from Qumran and read it as the regulations of God. This text begins with a history of the group, the tragedy of the exile, and the divine provision of a teacher who will give knowledge of how to preserve God's covenant from the Torah. He is known as the teacher of righteousness. By contrast, they call their opponent the man of lies who leads the people astray. This man of lies and his followers look for loopholes and easy interpretations. They acquit the guilty and punish the righteous. They violate the covenant and persecute those who continue to be righteous. The language around loopholes and easy interpretations appears to be halachic. That is, they are accusing their opponents of not keeping the commandments of Torah by claiming their interpretations to uphold commandments, while in reality, according to the Yachad, violate it. A similar flood of accusations occurs in Matthew chapter 23, where Jesus rails against the violations and practices of the Pharisees. This passage has an extremely unfortunate history, being used to stoke anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic hatred and violence. Jesus accuses the Pharisees of being blind guides, hypocrites, snakes, and a brood of vipers. While the name-calling vocabulary does not exactly overlap with the Damascus document, there is not much difference in the force of the language in Matthew than there are in the epithet of the man of lies or the congregation of traitors in the Damascus document. Both texts aggressively other their opponents and place them outside the bounds of acceptable behavior and in violation of the covenant. Furthermore, Jesus' accusations have a halacha or Torah referring cast to the rhetoric. He accuses them of looking for loopholes in the swearing of oaths or attending to minute aspects of tithing while missing the bigger picture, of being unclean and full of lawlessness. This is not halacha as we conceive of it in among the rabbis. Jesus is not here proffering his own interpretations against the scribes and the Pharisees. This is the rhetoric of a personal attack, a diatribe. However, accusations of halachic allegations are the attack. In fact, unusually for the ancient world, neither here nor in the Damascus document are accusations of any kind of sexual misbehavior. Josephus, for example, has to defend himself against claims that he and his soldiers mistreated women. But apparently Josephus was writing to a non-Jewish audience. For these intra-Jewish debates, halacha is inextricable. Matthew opens his gospel with the announcement that Joseph should name the child that Mary is pregnant with Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. Jesus' rant here against the scribes and the Pharisees brings that out. It is not by following the teachings, the halacha of the scribes and Pharisees, that Israel will be saved. On the contrary, they keep people out of the kingdom of heaven and condemn them to punishment in the afterlife. Up to the final chapters of Matthew, it is the teachings of Jesus that will save his people from their sins. Thus, both of these texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Gospel of Matthew put correct Torah observance in salvific contexts. To observe Torah correctly is to keep the covenant with God and procure salvation for the Jewish people. To violate whichever teacher's interpretation is to break the covenant and come under the threats of losing the promised home and the dwelling place of God. And thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Leah. This wonderful, wonderful presentation, which gives us a glimpse into your incredible scholarship and continued success to you. I won't jump in with some questions that I have because we're saving that for the end, and I'd like the audience to have that chance first. But again, thank you so much for your presentation. I want to just also thank Mahjabeen as well, again, Dr. Dalla, for your invitation to me and Dr. Aronoff, and to Dr. Kosba as well, for all being here. It's a pleasure to be with you all. For those who I haven't met, I'm Munir Jiwa. I direct the Center for Islamic Studies. As Dr. Dalla mentioned, we're delighted to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the GTU this year, as well as the 15th of the Center for Islamic Studies. I want to jump right into Dr. Kosba's presentation, but
if I may jump in here, Dr. Jiwa is having some technical difficulties, and I just want to jump in, and perhaps he can return to us, May, after your presentation. The only thing I would like to say is that I have been witness to Munir's reflecting on your work, May, and your dissertation, and the pride that he has taken in the quality of your scholarship, its brilliance, which is now well recognized in your receiving the postdoc at Princeton University. I know that you're tuning in from New Jersey right now. So forgive me, May, that I'm not equipped to offer a formal presentation of your bio. I can only say that during your years of graduate work at the GTU, you have really been a shining star of scholarship and community engagement. And I'm very excited, among everybody in this Zoom room, to hear about your work and your scholarship. So please, May, teach us. Well, thank you so much, Tina.
I don't know,
Good.
May, if I could just jump in for a minute. I'm so sorry, but I was
Is
really
this,
hoping that Munir could give this formal introduction, but I just wanted to say before May starts her presentation that May has been an extremely supportive colleague. So May and I were part of the same cohort as we started our doctoral studies. And I can say this much about May, that May is a well-read and thorough colleague. And this is her quality that has led to her success, of course, with the mentorship of Dr. Jiwa, but she's been an amazing colleague to work with. And I think we all are so proud of her at the Center for Islamic Studies for acquiring this postdoc position at Princeton. And her area of focus is race and identity. And especially she looks at the African diaspora and how does the Egyptian identity fit into that African diaspora. So I just wanted to add that sentence there. Sorry for the disruption. I was hoping that, Munir would not have those technical difficulties and he could give a more elaborate introduction for yourself. But we are so proud of you and we're so grateful for your time and for your presentation. It's all yours, May.
may I just chime in? I'm back. I don't know if you could see me or hear me. But if I could just add, yeah, thank you. If I could just add a word, because I'm really sorry for the technical difficulties. I just want to add what Dr. Dalla already mentioned. It's really, Dr. Kosba, it's an honor to call you Dr. Kosba.
I hope that Dr. Jiwa can return to us. And as I shared, I know that he very much is looking forward to May's words. So May, if you would be willing to begin, and we hope that Dr. Jiwa can return to us on the other side.
Thank you, Dina. Thank you, everybody. I don't know. I mean, thank you so much for all the amazing stuff that you said. I'm not good with taking this stuff. I'm not sure how to respond to it. I'm also still processing this phase. It all happened so quickly. And I'm so honored to be here. I'm so honored to be a part of this conversation. I first wanted to say greetings and shalom and assalamu alaikum to everyone. It is so wonderful to be here today. Thanks to the Center for Jewish Studies, Center for Islamic Studies, with the Madrasa-Midrasha program, Dr. Aronoff, Dr. Jiwa, Dr. Dalla. Thank you, Matt, my dear friend Matt, for organizing and coordinating this event and for being such a fantastic human being and scholar and friend. Mahjabeen also, like, it is so amazing to be on this side of the PhD journey, and it's always been great being with you in the classroom. I've learned so much from you, from your vast knowledge as well, and I'm always happy to be in conversations with my friends and my colleagues. I also want to thank my fellow panelists, Leah, for your fantastic presentation. Your work is amazing, and I wish I had like some experience or knowledge about your field, but it's amazing, and my work is so different from your work, and I guess that speaks to the richness of the GTU community and scholarship here. And so I just want to thank everybody here for allowing us to share our work and experience. I want to thank also, I see some friends in the audience. I want to thank everyone, my friends and everybody who joined us today. And today I will be discussing an aspect of an article adapted from my first chapter, the first chapter I wrote in my dissertation. And I think I can share my screen, right? So I prepared something not fancy. It's just a bunch of pictures. Just give me 1 second. Yeah, so in this dissertation, I wrote 7 chapters, and in addition to the introduction and conclusion. And as you can see, it's embarrassingly long. And the article in question will be actually published sometime, hopefully this year, inshallah. It's in a volume on race and Islam by Routledge. An elaborate and much more detailed version of this article appears in my dissertation under Race, Islam, and Racial Formation in Egypt. In both articles and the entire project, actually, in fact, I'm trying to understand and trace modern Egyptian understanding of race and racism and the ways in which it manifests in anti-Black racism today. In short, my dissertation tries to understand Egyptian race consciousness as perhaps directly shaped by the Egyptian anti-colonial intellectual tradition of the 19th and 20th centuries through Egypt's multi-layered history from an African and African diasporic lens, and against Orientalist narratives about Egypt. So I'm aiming to push the narrative beyond essentialism and biological arguments. My dissertation is divided in 3 parts. As you can see, I start chapter 1 again with providing a genealogy of race with lowercase g, not uppercase g, to avoid providing a meta-narrative, kind of channeling Foucault here, while also delineating the specter of the Atlantic that informs current scholarship on race and slavery in the Middle East under Islamic rule from the reality of these contexts in a way that lets these socio-historical and geopolitical contexts speak for themselves without being imbued with the language of different contexts, treating slavery as a trans-historical reality. And hopefully we can get to that in the discussion. In the second chapter, I provided an autobiographical analysis of an Egyptian Nubian man's lived experience who for the last 2 decades has been legally fighting the US government over his classification as a white man when he perceives himself as a Black person. Happy to discuss this more at some point. And in part 2, I use literature, fiction, to investigate the ways in which Egypt is imagined and Egyptian race consciousness is translated and represented. I do a comparative analysis of 3 novels. Begin with Bahat Tahir's novel, written in English, called Wahat al-Ghurub, or Sunset Oasis. This is I've included the Arabic and the Egyptian, the English translation by renowned British translator Humphrey Davis. And then David Graham Du Bois's novel, And Bid Him Sing. David Graham Du Bois is the stepson of W.E.B. Du Bois and the son of Shirley Graham Du Bois. He spent almost a decade in Egypt and wrote this novel in the 70s between Oakland and Cairo. And then Idris Ali, he's a famous Nubian novelist who wrote this novel, and this is the Arabic version of it and the English translation by Peter Thoreau. Then part 3, in chapter 6, I capitalize on delineating Orientalist and Muslim discourses on race and slavery in Islam. In chapter 7, focuses on the colonial construction of the Europeanized Egyptian, and reading it through Du Bois's concept of the double consciousness and the hermeneutics of the double consciousness from both secular and spiritual perspectives as a diagnostic tool that can help us grasp the complexity of Egyptian identity and race consciousness and their affinity with whiteness. These last 2 chapters actually are invested in reading these discourses through Black, Christian, and Muslim liberation theologies. As for this article, from a methodology perspective, I'm trying to address this from both theoretical and historical perspectives, and I will come to that in a second. But first, I want to ask everybody here a question. It is not directly relevant to this talk, but certainly plays an important role in shaping our perspectives, perhaps subconsciously. So here it goes. So when you hear Egyptians, what first jumps to your head? Versus when you hear ancient Egyptians, is it the same or different? Versus when you hear modern Egyptians, does the image in your psyche or imagination stand, or does it change? So who do you imagine the Egyptian today to be? And I'm not looking for answers. I just want you to grapple with it. So the history of race, and then back to the point to the article, the history of race and racism and slavery in Egypt is under-theorized and understudied. Egyptian history has often been written either from a Western Orientalist lens or from an Egyptian lens, aiming to reclaim identity, territory, and autonomy without critical investigation of race. However, in this way, you can perceive this study as a response also to the rising Euro-American centric interest in uncovering histories of racism and slavery in the Middle East, the Mediterranean, and the Ottoman Empire. This means that studies on race in the MENA region as an emerging field of study is dominated by Western scholars or scholars trained in Western traditions, academic traditions, writing in their native languages or in languages that are inaccessible to the people who are often the object of these types of studies. Some of them often overlook or dismiss, perhaps innocently, certain nuances in the traditions they are studying. And as a result, we find that while some scholars have grappled with presenting sophisticated accounts of the triangulated relationship between Islam, race, and slavery in the lands of Islam, some were unable to resist the urge to draw a straight line connecting European slavery in the Americas with slavery in the Mediterranean under Arab and Ottoman rule, mainly to show Muslim brutality. And here I would like to make a crucial clarification that it is imperative to critically study and scrutinize the histories of slavery and their association with different forms of racism, including anti-Black racism in any context. But as we do so, we are faced with major challenges, including the lexicons and taxonomies of race that are readily available for us today are primarily American-centric, no doubt. And so bringing them to bear on other contexts is tricky. You have to really sort of invent a language that is native to or reflexive of the socio-political, historical, cultural, and geographical context that you are studying. It is a challenge because most of the people who are writing about the modern medieval Muslim race consciousness are in the Western tradition. And so here I would like us to think about the question of positionality and who gets to speak for a certain community. And it is also important because there are bad practices. I actually prepared the bad practice, an example of that, but I don't think we have time. We can discuss it sometime later. But what interests me also in this is that when it comes to the Egyptian context, there's a question that often there's an underlying question that often tries to investigate the role that Arabness plays in the Egyptian identity. It's always an implicit, sometimes it depends on where you're coming from, the discipline, and how you formulate that, but I find this in my work as an implicit central question in the work that is in some of these interrogations. And so when we think about race in Egypt today, we can't help but factor in layers of history that span thousands of years. How far can we trace Egyptian conceptions of race? What happens when we isolate a particular time period, let us say the 19th and 20th centuries, when Egyptians were not only colonized by the Europeans, but they also have been under the Ottoman rule, they've been under the Mamluks, they have been under the Ayyubid dynasty, Fatimid dynasty, which is also like who adhere to the Ismaili branch of the Shiite Muslim tradition, and so on. So how do we know? How do we know that? How do we do that, knowing that race in Egypt could also mean that we carry out the insurmountable task of interrogating these histories, going back all the way to the ancient times, and how the ancient Egyptian, how ancient Egypt also encountered or interacted with the Greek and Roman, Persian, Nubian in Arabia also, and how they impacted the Egyptian sense of self. And then we can also make our way into the 20th and 21st century. So how do we make sense of the continuous rupturing and remaking of an Egyptian identity that is always becoming, imbued with the contradictions and debris of one fallen empire after another? As we stand in the middle of the 21st century, reflecting on the history of race and Islam in Egypt, how can we understand race in the consciousness of a predominantly Muslim Sunni Egyptian population today? What role does time play here? And just to, because I know for time, I'm just going to briefly say that the way I look at it, I use the Walter Benjamin's theory of time accumulation theory, to make sense of Egyptian race consciousness through these layers. In this article, I relied on his secular materialist conceptualization of time as it accumulates in material things, as he mainly commented on the industrialist commodity culture in the 19th century Europe. But in the future, in my book project, I intend to look deeper into this concept along with his theory of time from a messianic perspective. And it would be wonderful if I can also, like, do this comparative analysis between his like secular messianic concepts with an Islamic perspective. And yeah, I would love to hear your suggestions and comments, recommendations. Thank you all for hearing me out, and thank you.
Thank you so much, May. I definitely am having a moment of feeling extremely stimulated and interested in the work of our doctoral students. And it's such a wonderful thing to feel as a faculty member. So thank you both to Leah and to May for your presentations. And what we have now, lucky us, is a good, 15 minutes to have discussion and to take questions. I'm inclined, I don't see questions yet in the chat, to ask May and Leah whether you have comments or questions for one another. If, as you were speaking, something came to mind, it's clear to me that you're both working with very interesting kind of critical theoretical frameworks in rhetoric, sociology, in thinking about a positioning of identity in group and out group. Can I first open it up then to you both, if you had any reflections for one another? And also to turn to the community here in the Zoom room to post any questions that you may have in the chat. Leah?
I just want to say thank you to Dr. Kosba for her amazing presentation. It was really, really fascinating. And I'm going to out myself here as a nerd and ask if you've seen, I'm not going to ask if you've seen all of the new Marvel series, Moon Knight. But they did you have, okay, did you see the, because I found it really interesting where it was an Egyptian production and it was largely an Egyptian crew. And I found it really interesting in the documentary about how they made the series, where the director and the showrunner equated Egyptian with Arab in his comments about who the Egyptians were and who an Egyptian superhero was. So that was what was kind of, as you were talking about this, and this, I on the fringes of the African diaspora, I thought that was such a clear, kind of concise conception of the issue at hand.
Thank you so much, Leah. And it's such a great observation and a great question. There's a lot to say there's so many ways I could take this question. First of all, it was a great show. For many people, we're very excited to see this show. But for me, I guess the worst thing about being an academic is that you can't stop thinking and criticizing and spoiling every experience for people, especially people who are not like doing the same work. And I can't help doing that sometimes, actually all the time. I can't enjoy watching TV anymore. And that's exactly what happened with Moonlight, is that for me, I could see the Orientalist theme all the way through. First of all, the story is not written by an Egyptian. The whole production is made by an Egyptian team, which is still a big deal for Egyptian television, but artwork. But from a story perspective, the Orientalist theme is there. The idea of treating ancient Egypt or Egyptians as exotic people, and the interesting thing for me is that how Egyptians are still grappling with this question, like and I guess this is more a question, there's a soul searching question right now that is happening in Egyptian Egyptology, because there's a lot of within the field, there's a lot of internal battles between Egyptians and Western white Egyptologists who are constantly trying every side is trying to reclaim Egypt or ancient Egypt and define ancient Egypt in a certain way that it often carves out modern Egyptians from that identity and positions Egyptians as Arab. And then what I would like to do here is I would like us to, when we think about Arabness, or the Arab identity, we have to really think about it as a discursive, as a very heterogeneous identity, and it's not ethnic in the sense that even including Arabs themselves would like to think. There's Arabness and there's Arab nationalism, and so Arabness, the Arabization of Egypt. There's a whole history of when did that happen and how did that happen, and I don't think I can actually give you a definitive answer. I know I've come across in my work that during the Fatimid dynasty, that was around maybe 11th century Egypt, you could say that Egyptians were finally speaking Arabic. Like Arabic is like the language of the masses. Was it imposed on them? Nobody says that. Nobody says that Arabic was like imposed as an official language on Egyptians. But Arab nationalism is a whole different situation. It's a political movement that came out of a very specific context, and it was not defined or founded by Egyptians themselves. It was a movement that came from, that was also co-founded by Syrian migrants to Egypt who lived there during the 19th and 20th century, and then together they like really had to come up with an identity that can kind of like combine, like brings in Arabs in that part of the world to kind of fight the Ottoman rule, fight the Europeans, and it was not also defined by Arabs or Syrians and Egyptians in Egypt or in the region. It was also defined by Syrians in the diaspora, particularly in the United States. And you have to think about like how the U.S. context and the very particular history of racism and the treatment or mistreatment of Black African Americans in the U.S. has already influenced the way Syrians look at themselves and the way they wanted to define themselves across religious lines. And then how did that like transfer? Because they were not only in conversation with the Syrian community in the US, they were also in conversation with Syrians in the diaspora. And Egypt at the time was like one of the centers of like culture, like in the 19th and 20th centuries. So yeah, I mean, the Arab, what it means to be an Arab in the Egyptian context and in most of the Arab world is a fraught question, because it's always imagined as an ethnic identity, when it's ridiculous to flatten an entire identities into just one idea. I mean, we can go on and what that means, yeah. So thank you for that question.
Thank you, May. I think you're seeing also some questions in the chat coming your way. In fact, I think you've addressed one of them, but there's another that I'll leave you some moments to ponder, and maybe if I could direct a question to you, Leah, while you're taking in some of the chats. Leah, as you were speaking and pointing to really compelling, rhetorical common ground between, say, the Gospel of Matthew and Dead Sea Scroll polemics, enabling us to see the way in which the harsh polemics in Matthew, which, as you said, have a very tragic history in terms of how they're leveraged and used against Jewish populations. But what you're saying is look at that rhetoric in the context of the bitter polemics, intra-Jewish bitter polemics of that time. You, as part of your argument, you point out the fact that following a correct teacher is linked to really, what do I want to say, almost otherworldly promises of salvation. And I'm wondering if you've given some thought as to where that piece goes in terms of the history of the Jewish communities and later Christian communities that emerge. Where does that piece of future promise land in the reception of the gospel literature and in, let's say, rabbinic literature as well?
Well, the answer to that for Christians is a lot easier. It becomes this, it becomes heaven. You know, it becomes this paradise after death that one only enters through following Jesus. And this is part of my point, is that Christian tradition has suppressed the teachings, and especially the halachic implications of Jesus' teachings, to concentrate on his death on the cross, and this picture of it as a blood sacrifice. And the Eucharist in the Christian tradition, for example, becomes, especially in the Roman Catholic tradition, becomes the body and the blood of Christ. And by partaking that, you partake of Christ's own death and resurrection. And then it's this, you enter into this paradisical, life after death. One of the things that I didn't mention is that Jesus, in his diatribe, he mentions Gehenna, that the following the Pharisees, Gehenna is the name of this place after death of destruction, and in Christianity it becomes hell. It becomes, this whatever kind of place of punishment after death. The rabbis take it for the rabbis, and this may be in reaction to this very harsh rhetoric from pre-destruction, the rabbis, the closest they get, I think, is the Olam Haba, the world to come, and this promise, and they're not nearly so strict on how you get in. They don't, the rabbis kind of eject this, the great man, if you will, to borrow that term from sociology. They reject the charismatic teacher. There's Shia Cohen's article on Yavna, where his thesis is that the rejection of sectarianism is what makes the rabbis. And so the classical rabbis try to get much more soft about who gets in and who gets out in terms of this kind of reward or punishment after death. So it's opposite reactions. In fact, the Christians double down. All they have is the Jesus stuff, and they double down on this paradise and punishment after death, whereas the rabbis get a lot softer, and they just kind of back away from it, make it much easier. They don't even really talk about resurrection or heaven and hell, not nearly as much as the Christians do, even though it all comes from the same Jewish, this fertile Jewish tradition in this period.
Thank you so much. My mind is just exploding with further thoughts. May I redirect it to you, May, given some of the chat questions that were posed to you? And Leah, there's one more comment for you in the chat that you can have a look at. And I think we probably have time for May to share some further thoughts, and then maybe also to come back to you, Leah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dina. I'm reading the question on the novels. The characters, they're African. Well, so these 3 novels are written by 3 different individuals. One of them is by an Egyptian, and the other one is one of them is by an African-American writer, and the third is by a Nubian writer. So the goal was, I'm trying to see how, first of all, Egypt and the African-American imagination looms large, and so the way Egypt is imagined is something for me. I'm interested in learning, and what does it mean for me as an Egyptian today, and for Egyptians in general, because Pan-African is like the novel, Du Bois's novel, and Bid Him Sing, was written in the 70s. Like, he spent his time in Egypt in the 60s during the height of Pan-Africanism, and so kind of like looking back on that moment, and like, where was Egypt at the time, and where Egypt is at today, and then and I guess that question, that we can expand this question on the global South in general, like where is the global South movement, and where are we from anti-colonial when we talk about decolonizing, for example, today, how much of that is like, who's doing that work? And I don't think it's organized in any way the way it was in the 60s. And so for me, kind of like juxtaposing African-American perspective of Egypt and Egyptian race consciousness at the time in the 60s with a Nubian perspective, which was written about the same period in the 60s as well. In the Nubian novel, the Nubian and the African-American novel are actually autobiographical novels. So these authors were actually talking about their experience as Black people who lived in Egypt in this period. The Egyptian novel is basically trying to understand Egyptian subjectivity under the Ottoman rule during the British colonization of Egypt in the 1882, like in the beginning of the 19th century. So how did that shift, and how did that cause Egyptian identity to shift in certain ways? And in this novel, obviously talks about slavery, but slavery is not something that is often discussed in Egypt. And so for me to bring in, to center the question of slavery at a moment where the author himself is actually thinking, like many of the intellectuals in the 19th century, thinks of themselves as thinking of Egyptians as slaves under British colonization, and totally oblivious to the practice of slavery that is being done in their households, was really baffling for me. Like, for example, the protagonist of the novel had a concubine, and then who knows from where? Maybe we don't know if she was somewhere from West Africa, or maybe perhaps a Nubian slave. And then at the same time, he is totally oblivious to this experience, and at the same time, totally dismayed at the British colonization, and imagines this form of colonialism or as slavery. I think the wording is a bit interesting for me, and I try to deconstruct that. I'm sorry, I'm not good with short answers, so I'm trying to often think what can I say, what can I not say, and I'll just I actually have a question to Leah. I'm always interested in the question of methodology. And this, especially, being an interdisciplinary scholar, always it makes me nervous. And I wanted to ask you, because I don't know where to locate my areas. I'm all over the place, and I want to ask you, what is your, where do you place yourself, and what do you use in your work? What is your methodology, and what are the texts that you're dealing with?
Okay, wow. Yeah, so where do I have the same problems. Where do I place myself? I'm lucky that in the last, it's only been about 10 years, an area, an academic area has arisen called Ancient Judaism, which covers, and I mean, that's the thing, is that it covers everything. It covers text, it covers archaeology, it covers social, everything that you can think of. In terms of I've mostly placed myself in my methodology is socio-rhetoric. It's rhetoric, but it's not pure rhetoric. It's rhetoric. People wrote these texts, and they wrote them to an audience, and so you assume the audience understands the text. I use Brian Wilson and Michael Bakhtin, both of them very strongly. Daniel Boyarin at Cal, the work that he's done. Carol Newsom has done a lot of the pioneering work in the Dead Sea Scrolls, especially on sectarian rhetoric and this kind of thing. So those are a lot of the scholars that I look to, and that's kind of where it's the cross between, because what we have here are texts, and so it's the cross between sociology and verbal communication. So that's kind of where it's a good question, because I once said to someone that I was doing New Testament and rabbinics, and he looked at me and he said, "Oh, isn't that like old school, like Göttingen?" And for those who aren't aware, Göttingen is a university in Germany where a lot of Nazis came from, and their New Testament discipline is explicitly anti-Semitic, or it was until 1945. And I said, "Oh no," I said, "those were Lutherans reading the rabbis. I'm a Jew reading the New Testament." And he just walked away from me. Like he didn't know what to do with that. So my own identity is crossed, my academic, I know, so I 100% sympathize with you in that. I see our time is up. I'm just going to try to get to the last question. Does it qualify the assumption that Jesus is against Jews? I say it not only does it qualify it, it completely removes it. Matthew's Jesus, and I'm talking specifically here about Matthew's Jesus. The Jesus in the Gospel of John and the issue of the Jews is a completely separate issue. But Matthew's Jesus is thoroughly Jewish. Matthew's Jesus is a Jewish Jesus, and I believe that Matthew's Gospel is addressing a majority Jewish audience, and they're dealing with Jewish issues. They're dealing with Torah, they're dealing with the loss of Jerusalem, the diaspora, another place where my work crosses with May's. And so it's not that it qualifies any assumption about Jesus, is that it completely destroys it, and that Matthew's Jesus is a Jewish Jesus engaging in Jewish questions and using Jewish rhetoric and Jewish social understandings. So that's my answer to the question from the chat. And I've run over time, and I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you so much, Leah and May and Dina. Thank you for everyone who took this time out to share this hour with us. I'm so sorry, Dr. Jiwa, we couldn't hear more from you, but hopefully next time. And I hope those tech issues would be sorted out soon. There is so much that I could say. There are so many overlaps of being in that liminal space myself. Where do I belong? What table do I belong at? And even the taxonomy of race. I mean, I'm working on early African Muslim women, and I'm trying to reimagine imagine what race looked like in the 7th century. So there's so much that I am tempted to chime in with, but I will be respectful of everyone's time and very enthusiastically and heartfelt manner express gratitude for all the sharing that took place in this hour. Thank you, Dr. Kosba. Thank you, Leah. Thank you, Dr. Aronoff, Dr. Jiwa, to all those esteemed people in our audience who took the time to share this hour with us. May I just add a plug for our next event, which will be in November. Matt will be sending out notifications to all of us, but it will be on the subject of mystical reading in the true traditions. I see a hand raised. I wonder if that is by accident or if there is someone who wished to put a last word in. Okay, I see that the hand is not raised anymore. So thank you, or maybe that's just me mistaking a hand clap for a hand raised. So please excuse me for that, but thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your sharing. We wish everyone a great Wednesday and have a great rest of the week. And we'll see you at our next event. Thank you.